For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is Unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to this podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet and I'll be your host for the entirety of this podcast. I don't have any co-hosts or guests lined up as usual, so you're stuck with me for the entire time. My last podcast talked about the Grand Council in heaven and the events of that council, including the fall of Lucifer. Today, I'm going to zero in on the effects of Lucifer's fall and how that compares to the fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden. Since the fall of Adam is in the likeness of the fall of Lucifer during the Grand Council, we can learn a lot about one through our knowledge of the other. So that's the topic for today's discussion. For the nutshell version of this podcast, you can check out section 192 in my book that you can find on my website at unveilingjesuschrist.com. When Lucifer rebelled during the Grand Council on Kolob, he fell from his high station as a son of the morning, as I discussed in my last podcast on October 12 of 2025. The Book of Mormon specifically describes Lucifer's rebellion as a fall in 2 Nephi 9:8, which states, "For behold, if the flesh should rise no more, our spirits must become subject to that angel who fell from before the presence of the eternal God and became the devil, to rise no more." Close quote. Isaiah recognized Lucifer's fallen condition when he asked the question in Isaiah 14:12, saying, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning?" Father Lehi was probably reading these words of Isaiah from the brass plates when he wrote in 2 Nephi 2:17 that I, Lehi, according to the things which I have read, must needs suppose that an angel of God, according to that which is written, had fallen from heaven. Wherefore he became a devil, having sought that which was evil before God. Close quote. Hiram Andrus describes in more detail the fall of Lucifer that occurred at the time of his rebellion during the Grand Council, saying, "Lucifer's proposal to the Grand Council of the gods stood in vivid contrast to the one set forth by the Father. The Father therefore said, I will send the first. But because he chose Jehovah, Lucifer was angry and kept not his first estate. When frustrated in his design, Lucifer's ambitious nature exploded into rebellion. He sought for things which were unlawful," Joseph Smith observed, "and consequently he fell." Close quote. People sometimes speak of Lucifer's fall as the occasion when he was cast out of heaven down to this physical earth when the war in heaven ended. John describes this quote-unquote fall in Revelation 12:7-8, but that literal casting down of Lucifer's spirit body to this earth is not the spiritual fall described by Isaiah, Nephi, and Lehi. They're talking about a spiritual and metaphorical fall that occurred during the Grand Council when Lucifer fell from his high standing as a son of the morning to his very low standing as a devil and perdition. It can appropriately be called a fall from grace, which denotes a loss of power or a position of power and honor. More specifically, it is to descend from a position of divine favor to a position of sin and wickedness. This is the fall that Lucifer and his followers experienced when they rebelled during the Grand Council. Lucifer's fall on Kolob is a type for Adam's fall in the Garden of Eden. Hiram Andrus made this connection when he said that Joseph F. Smith, nephew of the prophet, likened the spiritual death which Lucifer and his followers suffered to that which Adam suffered as a result of his transgression in the Garden of Eden. Close quote. Kent Jackson also likened Lucifer's fall to the fall of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He likened the pride and arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar before his fall to that of Lucifer when Lucifer rebelled in heaven. To say that Lucifer's fall on Kolob is a type or foreshadow for Adam's fall in the Garden of Eden means that the conditions of Lucifer's fall during the Grand Council reflect the conditions of Adam's fall on earth. A knowledge of one is instructive about the other. Some of the shared similarities, typologies, and mirrored reflections include the following. First, before Lucifer's fall during the Grand Council on Kolob, all God's spirit children were pure and innocent in their first estate. And I talked about this in my podcast from October 5 of 2025. So we don't need to belabor that point. In a prior podcast, I also pointed out that the Grand Council had to be held on Kolob away from God's celestial residence because the Father knew there would be rebellion during the Grand Council accompanied by spiritual uncleanness on Kolob. And again, I discussed this in more detail in my last podcast on October 7 of 2025. So before that uncleanness could occur, God's spirit children left their home on God's celestial residence. It's like God sent us off to college after rearing us and educating us for eons of time in his home, on his home planet before the Grand Council was convened. From that time, we took up our abode on Kolob as described by Joseph Fielding McConkie, who said, "Do we have any idea where we lived in our premortal or first estate?" Answer, yes. In a poem written by the prophet Joseph Smith, we find this line, "From the council in Kolob to time on the earth. If Kolob, the planet nearest to the residence of God, is where the Grand Council was held, it seems reasonable to suppose that it was also the planet upon which we resided in our premortal estate." Close quote. Kolob, as you'll recall, was the first spirit world created by God during the spirit creation, and it was located nearest to God's celestial residence and his throne in heaven, as I discussed in my podcast from September 28 of 2025. Even though the Father sent all his children off to college on Kolob, and I have to add, it may have been a community college because Kolob wasn't that far away from God's celestial residence. But in any event, he went with us and we remained in his presence. It's kind of like freshman orientation week and the parents get to attend. Obviously, the Father had to be with us on Kolob for the Grand Council because he convened the council and he had to preside at the council. He had to be with us to implement his plan of salvation. I've reiterated some of the points I've made in prior podcasts to make the point that these events in premortality have their likeness on earth, beginning with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Just as God's spirit children were sent off to college on Kolob as pure and innocent college freshmen, so also Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden in their purity and innocence, as explained by Marion G. Romney, who said, "Adam and Eve, when created as living souls, were endowed with the faculty to live forever. They were sinless, pure, and holy, worthy to enjoy, and they did enjoy, the society of God their Father. As a matter of fact, he visited them in the Garden of Eden and conversed with them and instructed them." Close quote. In other words, it's freshman orientation in the Garden of Eden, and the Father is there to give them direction and support because this college stuff is all very new to Adam and Eve. That is to say that while Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden before the transgression of Adam, they were in the immediate and actual presence of God, their Father. Until Adam's fall, they talked face to face, as we're told by James Talmage, saying, "The scriptures inform us that prior to his transgression in Eden, Adam held direct and personal communion with God, and that one of the immediate consequences of his fall which was brought about through disobedience, was his forfeiture of that exalted association. He was shut out from the presence of God, and though he heard the divine voice, he no longer was permitted to behold the presence of the Lord. Close quote. The transgression that we're talking about, of course, occurred when Adam knowingly partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that the Lord had expressly commanded him not to partake of. Orson Pratt explains what occurred, saying, "It is recorded in Scripture history that our first parents, while in the Garden of Eden, transgressed a certain law and commandment of the Almighty by partaking of a certain forbidden fruit, which transgression brought them under condemnation and subjected them to a certain penalty, which was the death of their bodies of flesh and bones. Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return, was the penalty pronounced upon Adam. Previous to this, Adam was pure, innocent being. He was not contaminated with sin and was entirely destitute of the knowledge of good and evil." Close quote. From the foregoing, we learn that Adam and Eve innocently lived in God's presence in the garden until the fall of Adam. They would have remained there in that same condition forever, without the possibility of progression. The transgression of Adam was a necessary fall forward. The same can be said of our premortal existence prior to the time of the Grand Council. We were in a state of purity and innocence that would have continued forever but for the fall of Lucifer. The rebellion of Lucifer during the Grand Council was also a fall forward. The first estate lasted eons of time from the spirit creation until the Grand Council in heaven, as I discussed in my podcast from October 5 of 2025. This was a time when spirits were born, when they grew to maturity as spirits and were educated by their heavenly parents, as stated in this quote from the 1992 Sperry Symposium, saying, "There was a period from the beginning of the earth's creation back to the council in heaven, and even further back was our birth as spirit children, and a maturing period to become an adult male or female spirit before the council in heaven. Even a conservative estimate of these earlier periods, and perhaps it really was eons of time, makes it evident that we waited a substantial period of time as single adults to come to this earth to experience marriage and the privilege of beginning our own family life." Close quote. Throughout this long period of instruction, our premortal spirits were not accountable until we received God's law by way of commandment and covenant during the Grand Council. In his epistle to the Romans, Paul said, "Where no law is, there is no transgression." 2 Nephi 9:25 mirrors this language, saying, "Where there is no law given, there is no punishment, and where there is no punishment, there is no condemnation." Similarly, where there is no law, there is no sin. George F. Reynolds said, "Sin is not imputed where there is no law, and where there is no law, there is no judgment." George Q. Cannon has also said that God does not hold people accountable for that which they do not know, or that which they have not had an opportunity of knowing. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. Transgression commences when the law is received and men reject it. Close quote. The foregoing doctrines and principles of the gospel in mortality were equally applicable in premortality prior to the Grand Council, when God implemented gospel law among all his spirit children. The Encyclopedia of Mormonism states that one purpose of the Heavenly Council was to allow the spirits the opportunity to accept or reject the Father's plan of salvation, which proposed that an earth be created, whereon his spirit children could dwell, each in a physical body. Such a life would serve as a probationary state to see if they would do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. The spirits of all mankind were free to accept or reject the Father's plan, but they were also responsible for their choice. Close quote. Adam and Eve were similarly instructed by God in the Garden of Eden before the fall of Adam. They were given laws which made them accountable, as were reminded by Elder Bruce R. McConkie, who said, "To Adam and Eve the command came, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. Nevertheless thou mayest choose for thyself, for it is given unto thee. But remember that I forbid it, for in the day thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die." Close quote. Adam and Eve knew what law had been given. They knew right from wrong, and they had their agency to obey or disobey. Satan beguiled Eve and deceived her into partaking of the forbidden fruit. This transgression by deception was not sufficient to bring about the fall of all creation. When Adam partook of the forbidden fruit, he did so knowingly. He did so with his eyes wide open, in the same way that Lucifer rebelled during the Grand Council. Adam and Eve would have lived forever in the garden if Adam had not fallen by reason of his transgression, as we're told in 2 Nephi 2:22, saying, "If Adam had not transgressed, he would not have fallen, but he would have remained in the Garden of Eden, and all things which were created must have remained in the same state in which they were after they were created, and they must have remained forever and had no end." Close quote. This means they would have remained forever in a state of immortality. There would be no death. Their innocence would continue. They would have had no children. This would have frustrated the entire plan of salvation. There would be no probationary experience on earth. There would be no sin, which means there was no need for an atonement. There would be no forgiveness and no resurrection, because there would be no death. The fact that Adam and Eve would have lived forever in the Garden of Eden also suggests that all God's spirit children would have lived forever as premortal spirits on Kolob if Lucifer had not fallen by reason of his rebellion and had not introduced sinful conditions during the Grand Council in heaven. Lucifer's rebellion brought an end to innocence in the first estate, just as Adam's transgression brought an end to innocence in the second estate. Joseph Fielding Smith said, "Every spirit was innocent in the beginning. When Lucifer rebelled because of his agency, he persuaded others to follow him. Then their innocence came to an end." Close quote. Brent Topp has also said, "The Lord may also have been referring to the premortal effects of the atonement in modern revelation to the prophet Joseph. Every spirit of man was innocent in the beginning, and God, having redeemed man from the fall, men became again, in their infant state, innocent before God." The key word is again. This seems to indicate that men had lost innocence in the premortal world through sin and disobedience. Close quote. Brother Topp's conclusion that God's spirit children seemingly lost their innocence in premortality is, in my opinion, an absolute certainty, and it began with the fall of Lucifer. So we now have to ask ourselves the question of whether Lucifer's fall brought about a spiritual fall of all God's spirit creations in the same way that Adam's fall brought a physical fall to all Christ's physical creations. And I think the answer to this question is yes. When Adam fell, all the physical creations of Christ became subject to Adam's fall. And when Lucifer fell, all God's spirit children became subject to Lucifer's fall. Jesus Christ is the obvious exception in both cases. He did not fall spiritually at the time of Lucifer's fall, nor was he subject to the fall of Adam at the time of his mortal birth. Christ was not subject to the physical fall of Adam because God, the Father, was Jesus Christ's literal Father, and so Christ had life within himself. Similarly, Christ was not subject to the spiritual fall of Lucifer during the Grand Council because he was perfect and he had already achieved godhood in that sphere. Everything and everyone else, however, was subject to the fall of Lucifer and became in some measure unclean and unworthy to remain in the presence of God the Father and his first begotten Son, Jesus Christ. In the same way, when Adam fell, everything became mortal and was subject to death. All creation fell to a telestial state and was unclean, and could therefore no longer remain in the presence of God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ. Adam and Eve were thus expelled from the Garden of Eden and out of the presence of the Father and the Son. We find a similar situation in the case of God's children on Kolob when, according to Revelation 12:5 and 6, a large group of them were removed from Kolob, that place of uncleanness and sin, during the heavenly apostasy, where they went and returned to God's presence on his celestial residence. So we again have these kinds of likenesses going on in this situation. Prior to the fall of Lucifer, the conditions on Kolob were celestial conditions. This conclusion naturally follows from the necessary and logical assumption that God did not create anything that was less than celestial during the spirit creation. This does not contradict my earlier statements that spirit worlds were organized according to the measure of their intelligence, such that some worlds were destined to become telestial worlds and others were destined to become terrestrial and celestial worlds. God did not organize some worlds less perfectly than others. These worlds of spirit differ only because their inherent intelligence or capacity to obey law differed from one world to the next. All the spirit worlds created by God were perfect in their sphere, and Kolob was a celestial world whose inherent intelligence gave it the capacity to obey celestial law. Thus, conditions on Kolob were celestial conditions prior to the fall of Lucifer. It was and is a celestial world, and the conditions on Kolob were therefore celestial conditions from the time of the spirit creation until the fall of Lucifer during the Grand Council. The celestial conditions on Kolob ended when Lucifer's fall introduced sin into that otherwise clean environment. Brent Top explains the necessity of this change without explaining the mechanics of it, saying, "Some have attempted to portray the premortal home as a glorious celestial kingdom wherein no unclean thing can dwell, where there is only goodness, righteousness, and obedience, a place in the constant presence of God where the spirits would have no desire or outlet for anything less than celestial thoughts or actions. Such a view would not allow for an unfettered power of choice or for the need for faith and continual diligence, and would eliminate the diversity among the spirits." Close quote. The mechanics of the fall were, of course, Lucifer's pride, which the Book of Mormon reference companion characterizes as the first sin that caused Lucifer to fall from his high standing as a son of the morning, and he dragged down a lot of other spirits with him. David O. McKay talked about the conditions that came to exist after the fall of Lucifer, saying, "Hate had its origin in our pre-existent state. There is a significant reference in the Apocalypse to a war in heaven. It is not only significant, but seemingly contradictory, for we think of heaven as a celestial abode of bliss, an impossible condition where war and contention could exist." Close quote. Obviously, the Father planned for and permitted Lucifer's fall to fulfill his eternal purposes, just as he planned for and permitted Adam's fall to fulfill his purposes, as explained by Joseph Fielding Smith, who said, "If our eternal Father refused to permit evil to exist in the world, he would destroy one of the greatest gifts ever given to man, the gift of free agency. Take this great gift away, and there could be no rewards or punishments, no exaltation and no condemnation. The result would be chaos, confusion. This is indeed the very plan that Lucifer presented in the Grand Council in heaven. It is absolutely necessary to permit evil as well as it is necessary to reward good." Close quote. Lucifer's fall didn't just cause sin and uncleanness among God's spirit children, it caused an apostasy in heaven that John described in Revelation 12:6, which is often overlooked as leaders of the church discuss the war in heaven instead. John Whitsoe describes the apostasy that occurred after Lucifer's fall, saying, "A being may choose wisely and well throughout the ages of existence until great progress has been achieved, and then he may turn against truth and actively reject that which made his rise possible and become opposed to those with whom he was formerly associated." This is not an uncommon experience among human beings. It also occurs in the spirit world. Such a change or apostasy results from sin, negligence of duty, ambition, greed, selfishness, jealousy, impurity, or any of the many acts that defeat progress. The story of Lucifer is the most terrible example of such apostasy. Lucifer, son of the morning, through diligent search for truth and the use of it, had become one of the foremost in the assembly of those invited to undertake the experiences of earth. But in that great council, his personal ambition and love of power overcame him. He pitted his own plan and will against the purposes of God. He strove to gain the birthright of his elder brother Jesus, the Christ. When his proposition was rejected, he forsook all that he had gained, would not repent of his sin, defied truth, and of necessity lost his place among the followers of God. 1/3 of the spirits present in that vast assembly supported Satan and became enemies of the truth that they had formerly cherished. Close quote. Obviously, the conditions on Kolob after the fall of Lucifer mirror the conditions on earth after Adam fell in the Garden of Eden. We often say that the fall of Adam brought an end to the paradisiacal conditions that existed on the earth. It is not uncommon for people in the church to say that these paradisiacal conditions were a terrestrial condition. For example, Victor L. Ludlow has said, "The earth itself will be elevated from a lesser worldly or telestial state to its original terrestrial or paradisiacal order, which it enjoyed before the fall of Adam." Close quote. Bruce R. McConkie has likewise said that in Eden's garden, call it a primeval paradise if you will, man dwelt in paradisiacal glory. The temporal creation of all things was terrestrial in nature. Then came the fall, a fall from a terrestrial to a telestial state. Close quote. Statements like this have always caused me to question why the paradisiacal earth before the fall is considered to be in a terrestrial state rather than a celestial state. After all, this is a celestial world with the capacity to conform to celestial law. Doesn't this label suggest that when Christ created the physical earth, he was less than perfect in his creative endeavors, such that the earth ended up as a terrestrial world rather than a more perfect celestial world before the fall of Adam? It makes you wonder if Christ finished with the physical creation, and as he looked back on his handiwork, he realized that it had turned out to be a terrestrial earth and said, "Oops, my bad. I don't think so." And yet we always refer to the paradisiacal conditions of the Eden as terrestrial rather than celestial. So I just wonder why that is. Now, I have a couple of theories on this. First, the word terrestrial comes from the late 14th century Latin term terrestris, which comes from terra, which means earth or land. The word showed up in the English language in about the 15th century to describe anything related to the earth, as opposed to heavenly or celestial bodies. So it means to be of, on, or relating to the earth. Based on this definition, it is perfectly correct to say that earth was a terrestrial earth at the time of its creation. In this sentence, terrestrial is simply a descriptive noun. It describes the physical earth at its creation as earthly. It was an earthly earth, a physical earth, as opposed to a celestial, heavenly spirit world. This kind of reminds me of the classic cartoon called Winnie the Pooh that had this lovable character called Tigger. Now, Tigger considered himself to be a rather ferocious and fearless critter in all respects, except that he was terribly afraid of heights. On several pages of the story, Tigger bounced himself to the top of a tree and became frozen by fear when he realized that he almost bounced himself out of the top of the book. The only way to get Tigger down was to turn the book sideways so the top of the tree came nearly into contact with the earth. As soon as Tigger stepped foot on the earth, he was thrilled and said, "Good old terra firma." He used the word terra, as in terrestrial, as a noun, describing the firm earth that he was so happy to be reunited with. What we learned from Tigger is that the terrestrial earth, this terra firma, effectively describes the physicality of the earth, which may or may not be a statement of its spiritual condition. There's just one thing that I don't like about this whole explanation, however. We learn in the 10th article of faith that during the millennium, the earth will be renewed and restored to its paradisiacal glory, which means terrestrial glory. And plenty of people talk about the millennium as a terrestrial condition. This terrestrial business in that context is a place where people who qualify for the terrestrial kingdom can abide the day. So if we're going to restore the earth to a terrestrial glory that existed in the Garden of Eden, according to the 10th article of faith, that must mean that the earth was indeed terrestrial before the fall of Adam. In other words, it wasn't just terrestrial in the sense of physical and earthly and non-celestial, as in heavenly. Its spiritual condition was indeed terrestrial, as opposed to its telestial condition after the fall and its celestial condition before its physical creation. Now, there is a sort of symmetry and order in all this that is very neat and tidy. The earth went from a celestial spirit world before the physical creation to a terrestrial earth after the physical creation and before the fall of Adam. When Adam fell, the earth fell to a telestial condition that will be restored to a terrestrial condition during the millennium. The earth will again be celestial after it dies and is resurrected. So do you see the creative pattern? The earth started out celestial and it ends celestial. That is, in its first spirit creation, it was celestial. In its second physical creation, it became terrestrial and then telestial after the fall. At the second coming, the earth is renewed to its terrestrial condition again, and finally, in its third creation that we call the resurrection, the earth goes back to its celestial condition. So if you want to know more about the three creations that I just talked about, you'll need to go back to my podcast that talks about the order of the creation from September 21st of 2025, and you can check it out there. Now, I've gotten a bit off the path here, so let's return to our discussion of the similarities between the fall of Lucifer and the fall of Adam. The fallen conditions on Kolob fostered the necessary testing and development of human spirits in premortality, just as the fallen conditions on this earth foster the necessary testing and human development in mortality. Abraham chapter 3, verses 25 to 26 tell us that when the physical earth was still in the planning stage, God's premortal children were to be tested in their premortal estate as follows. We will prove them herewith, to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. And they who keep their first estate shall be added upon. Close quote. Many scholars and leaders in the church will tell you that the war in heaven was the ultimate premortal test. That's true in the sense that it was the final premortal test. However, our testing began as soon as Lucifer rebelled and fell during the Grand Council, and spirits had to decide whether to fight him or join him. The following quote by Joseph Fielding McConkie envisions the kind of testing involved in our first estate, saying, We lived an infinitely long period of time in the premortal existence. There we developed talents, aptitudes, and capacities which would bless us in this, the second estate. We who are blessed with membership in the church passed many tests in that pristine estate, proved true and faithful to the Father's plan, and merited a calling or election, including the assurance that we would tabernacle the flesh through a chosen lineage, the house of Israel, which would facilitate our reception and observance of gospel law. Much longing and waiting, much preparation and planning, much testing and trying were undertaken and accomplished before we ever came here. Close quote. Lucifer's fall created the opportunity for opposition that fostered growth among God's premortal spirit children in their first estate, just as Adam's fall created the opportunity for growth through opposition in this mortal second estate. Our premortal opposition was an exercise in faith building, as described in Alma 13:3, which states, "And in this manner, after which they were ordained, being called and prepared from the foundation of the world according to the foreknowledge of God, on account of their exceeding faith and good works, in the first place being left to choose good or evil. Therefore, they having chosen good and exercising exceedingly great faith are called with a holy calling, yea, with that holy calling which was prepared with, and according to, a preparatory redemption for such." Close quote. Our proven faithfulness in premortal conditions of trial and testing made us worthy to enter our second estate with this promise from Abraham 3, verse 26, which states, "And they who keep their second estate shall have glory added upon their heads forever and ever." Close quote. This same principle is set forth in Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verses 18 to 19, which says, "Whatever principle of intelligence we attain unto in this life, it will rise with us in the resurrection. And if a person gains more knowledge and intelligence in this life through his diligence and obedience than another, he will have so much the advantage in the world to come." Close quote. This would not be possible had it not been for the fall of Lucifer in our premortal first estate and the fall of Adam in our second mortal estate, as James Talmage implicitly acknowledges in the following quote, saying, "Yet this promotion to the mortal state is regarded by many as a degradation, and we are prone to bewail the fallen condition of the race as an unmitigated calamity. The Scriptures make plain the glorious truth that man may rise far above the plane upon which he existed before his birth in the flesh. We have stooped that we may conquer. We have been permitted to descend only that we may attain greater heights." Close quote. Hiram Andrus also recognizes the importance of the opposition created by both the fall of Lucifer and the fall of Adam, saying, "Opposition is necessary if man is to become an independent being on earth and in eternity. To attain true independence, man must obey freely the laws of life and not succumb to the influence of opposing forces. Although opposition arises from the influence of a recalcitrant life, it is a necessary factor in human development. Strange and inconsistent though it may seem, Satan and his adherents in the spirit world and on the earth are necessary factors in the divine plan of life. Their influence is designed to aid man to become like God." Close quote. Lucifer's fall during the Grand Council created an environment of contention, anger, and hatred on Kolob, where God could not remain because no unclean thing can be in God's presence, as we're told in Moses 6, verse 57, which states, "Wherefore, teach it unto your children that all men everywhere must repent, or they can in no wise inherit the kingdom of God. For no unclean thing can dwell there, or dwell in his presence." Close quote. The same principle is repeated in 1 Nephi 10:21, which states, "If ye have sought to do wickedly in the days of your probation, then ye are found unclean before the judgment seat of God, and no unclean thing can dwell with God." Close quote. So here's the situation. God the Father was present on Kolob to preside over the grand council in heaven. Lucifer rebels and he falls spiritually. In addition, all spirit life forms on Kolob fall with Lucifer in the likeness of Adam's fall in the Garden of Eden. When this occurs, someone immediately recognizes the problem and says, "Houston, we have a problem." Actually, I think the Father recognized the problem of uncleanness on Kolob immediately and knew that he had to get out of Dodge because he can't dwell in an unholy place and no unclean thing can be in his presence. It's kind of interesting because Brent Topp recognized this problematic conflict, and in an effort to reconcile God's presence on a fallen Kolob with the scriptures that say God cannot dwell in an unclean place, Brother Topp said, several scriptural passages state that no unclean thing can dwell in God's presence, and it gives examples. But none of these passages have authoritatively been interpreted to have application to the premortal world. D&C 76, verses 51 to 52 and 62, and also Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, verses 14 to 21, clearly teach that dwelling in God's presence refers to postmortal exaltation. Close quote. I certainly agree that the scriptures say that God cannot dwell in unclean places in postmortality, but that doesn't mean that the same theory or the same principle or same doctrine doesn't apply in the premortal existence. I mean, these are mirrors of each other. They're patterned after each other. So we shouldn't assume that he can dwell in unclean places in premortality. I'm of the opinion that where the scriptures say that God cannot dwell in an unclean place, this is a rule of uniform application. We see it illustrated in the Garden of Eden. When Adam committed his transgression and became unclean, the Father could no longer have his presence in that environment. And so he kicked out Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The same is obviously true in the premortal spirit world after the fall of Lucifer. The one is in the likeness of the other. This means that the Father had to withdraw his presence from Kolob in the premortal first estate, just as he withdrew his presence from the Garden of Eden in his mortal second estate. John actually describes the withdrawal of the Father's presence and that of his sinless Son from Kolob in Revelation 12, verses 5 and 6, saying, "And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God, and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God." Close quote. We're going to get into the details of this premortal apostasy in just a few podcasts from now. For now, it's sufficient to note that both the Father and Jehovah withdrew their persons and spiritual presence from Kolob to God's celestial residence in heaven after Lucifer fell. It is a simple fact that light and darkness cannot occupy the same space. That was true at the time of Lucifer's fall in premortality, and it was true at the time of Adam's fall in mortality, as we're told by Rodney Turner, who said, "Adam and Eve's transgression made them spiritually contaminated. Since no unclean thing can dwell in the presence of God, he could not permit his intimate association with his errant children to continue. Divine law required that they be driven from the Garden of Eden." Close quote. When Adam fell, a veil was drawn between this mortal earth and God's heavenly sphere or dwelling, which is described by Hugh Nibley, who said, "Not only is God rendered invisible by the impenetrable veil of light that surrounds him, but he has purposely placed veils between the worlds, that all treasures may be hid up from those who do not seek them in the proper way. On the other side of the veil of the temple lay the secrets of heaven, the celestial spaces which know no bounds, and all that they contained. The whilon, or veil, quarantines this polluted world mercifully from the rest. Beyond the veil are the heavens, and that goes for other worlds as well as this one, for each is shut off by its veil. For there are eons and veils and firmaments. He made a veil for their world surrounding them like a wall. Behind the ultimate veil sits Jew, the father of the treasury of light, who is separated from all other by the veils, a veil being that which separates that which is above from that which is below. Close quote. Adam and Eve experienced a spiritual death when they were shut out from the persons and presence of God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ. Adam and Eve died spiritually as a veil was drawn to separate them from God's person and glory. Joseph Fielding Smith explained what it means to die spiritually when he said, "Spiritual death is defined as a state of spiritual alienation from God, the eternal separation from the Supreme Being. Condemnation to everlasting punishment is also called the second death. In other words, the second or spiritual death, which is the final judgment passed upon the wicked, is the same as the first death, banishment from the presence of the Lord." Close quote. The spiritual death of Adam and Eve meant that they could no longer behold the face of God and communicate with God face to face. They could hear his voice from outside the garden, but there was a veil otherwise drawn between them. They were left with the light of Christ to quicken their lives in mortality. Adam and Eve's children, of course, inherit this condition of spiritual death as they are born into mortality, which leads us to conclude that spiritual death came not only to Lucifer and his rebellious followers, but everyone in the same proximity on Kolob. That's why there was this general spiritual fall that came to exist as a result of the fall of Lucifer. So the same conditions that came to exist after the fall of Adam also came to exist on Kolob after the fall of Lucifer. That is, spiritual death came to Lucifer immediately and to all God's spirit children that remained on Kolob when the Father and Jehovah withdrew, as recorded in Revelation 12, 5 and 6. Doctrine and Covenants, section 7625, describes Lucifer's spiritual fall at the time of his rebellion during the council in heaven, saying, "And this we saw also, and bear record, that an angel of God, who was in authority in the presence of God, who rebelled against the only begotten Son, whom the Father loved, and who was in the bosom of the Father, was thrust down from the presence of God and the Son." Close quote. It's pretty clear that this verse is describing Lucifer's fall during the Grand Council and not his fall or being cast down to this physical earth when he was defeated at the end of the war in heaven. George Reynolds connects the spiritual fall of Lucifer and his banishment from the presence of God with his rebellion during the Grand Council and not his defeat after the war in heaven, saying, "From the very first, when after the great council in heaven, Lucifer, who became the devil, was cast out from his presence, he became an enemy of God, and thereafter, without stoppage, has fought truth and also the righteousness which is in God." Close quote. Hoyt Brewster also confirms the spiritual death of both Lucifer and his followers that resulted from their spiritual fall during the Grand Council and the spiritual death of Adam and Eve after their spiritual fall in the Garden of Eden, saying, "The first death which was suffered by Adam and Eve upon their banishment from the Garden of Eden is described by Alma as being cut off, both temporally and spiritually, from the presence of the Lord. The parents of the human race were not the first to suffer such a death, for it had been previously decreed for Lucifer and those spirits who chose to follow him in rebelling against righteousness." Close quote. The foregoing doctrines and principles are the very reason why God and Jesus Christ withdrew their persons and presence from Kolob after Lucifer fell, and why they withdrew their persons and presence from Adam and Eve after the fall of Adam. We know quite a bit about the spiritual fall of Adam and Eve when they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, And through that lens, we can have a perfect understanding about the spiritual fall of Lucifer and his followers when they rebelled during the Grand Council. As you can see, there are many similarities and likenesses between the fall of Lucifer during the Grand Council and the fall of Adam when he partook of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. So that concludes my summary of these various likenesses, but maybe you can think of others as well. My next podcast is going to talk about the start of the physical creation by Jehovah. We're not going to start with the physical creation of this earth because this earth was created last among all the worlds that Christ physically created, which I talked about in my podcast from September 23 of 2025 and September 28 of 2025. So you can go back and check those out. So therefore, my next podcast will begin with the physical creation of the first world of the physical creation. The creation of that first world coincided with the end of the Grand Council and the departure of God the Father and Jesus Christ from Kolob. So if you're not sure on the creative sequence, I'd suggest that you go back and listen to the podcast that I just mentioned before you listen to my next podcast. Otherwise, it might be, like a fire hose pouring water down your throat. In any event, until next time, thanks for watching, listening, sharing, and subscribing, and to Jen and Kristen for all their technical help. I'll see you next time on Unveiling Jesus Christ.